The boardroom on the 50th floor of Automotive Mendoza vibrated with tension as CEO Isabel Mendoza, heiress to a $2 billion empire, came face to face with the biggest failure of her career. A revolutionary engine that no engineer had managed to make work. Facing her, in her glass and steel office overlooking Madrid, were 12 of the best engineers in Europe who had worked in vain on the prototype for 6 months. Isabel, 29, famous for her arrogance, was about to lose a $500 million contract with Seat when a cleaning employee knocked on the door. It was Carlos Ruiz, 32, a disgraced former Formula One mechanic, who now cleaned offices to survive. With a glance at the engine, he said, "Ma'am, I know it's wrong." Isabel burst into contemptuous laughter and, in front of all the managers, launched the most reckless challenge of her life. "If you manage to fix this engine that 12 engineers haven't been able to repair, I'll marry you." The room fell silent. Carlos looked her directly in the eyes and replied, "I accept." What happened in the following hours not only changed the fate of the company, but also the lives of two people whom fate had tested in the most unexpected way. The 50th floor of the Mendoza automotive skyscraper dominated the Madrid skyline like a monument to Spanish industrial power. Behind the glass walls of the most prestigious office, Isabel Mendoza, 29-year-old CEO of the third generation, contemplated with growing frustration the engine that threatened to destroy the empire built by her grandfather. 6 months earlier, Automotive Mendoza had signed the most important contract in its history, to supply Seat with a revolutionary hybrid engine for the new limited edition hypercar. $500 million at stake. A figure that would have definitively consolidated the company's position among the world leaders in automotive technology. The project seemed perfect on paper. The research and development team had designed a propulsion system that combined a traditional B1 with a state-of-the-art electric system. The simulations showed extraordinary performance, 100 horsepower, near-zero emissions, unprecedented energy efficiency, but the reality had turned out to be very different. The prototype stubbornly refused to function correctly. Each attempt to start it up ended with abnormal vibrations, inexplicable overheating, and a metallic noise that made the technicians shudder. That November morning, the 12th emergency meeting of the month had brought together the company's best minds in Isabel's office. 12 engineers stood around the glass table looking at the engine displayed like a modern work of art that refused to come to life. Dr. Alejandro Herrera, head of the project and a Formula One veteran, shook his head for the umpteenth time. "I had tried every solution imaginable. Software modifications, mapping adjustments, cooling system optimizations. Nothing was working." Isabel paced nervously behind her desk. Seat's ultimatum would expire in 3 days. If the engine failed, the company would lose not only $500 million, but also the reputation built over 70 years. The engineers argued, their voices growing increasingly agitated. Some proposed starting over, others suggested external consultants, some talked about admitting defeat. Isabel listened to them with growing irritation. It was at that moment that someone knocked on the glass door. They all turned away, annoyed. Isabel's meetings were never interrupted, but through the glass you could see a man in gray work overalls with a cleaning cart beside him. Isabel made a gesture of annoyance towards the secretary, indicating that she did not want to be bothered. But the man knocked again, more insistently. He had a serious expression that contrasted with the humility of his position. Exasperated, Isabel went to open it herself. The man was in his 30s, tall and thin, with calloused hands that betrayed years of manual labor. His dark eyes were fixed not on Isabel, but on the engine on display in the center of the room. He introduced himself as Carlos Ruiz, a night cleaning employee. Then, looking at the prototype, he simply said that he knew it was wrong. The room erupted in collective laughter. 12 engineers with prestigious degrees could not solve the problem, and a cleaning employee claimed to have the solution. Isabel asked who it was. Carlos explained that he had been working there for 6 months in cleaning, but before that he worked on engines. When Herrera asked him where, Carlos replied ironically that he had been the chief mechanic for the Rojo Fuego Formula One team. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone knew Rojo Fuego, the team that had dominated the lower categories before disappearing in a financial scandal 2 years earlier. The mention of the Rojo Fuego racing team transformed the atmosphere in the room. Rojo Fuego had been a legend in the world of motors, a small Spanish team that had challenged international giants with brilliant innovations. Herrera, who had met some members of the team, became more serious. He confirmed that Carlos Ruiz was indeed the technician who had developed the variable injection system for the 488 challenge. Carlos explained what had happened to him when the fire red broke. He had been accused of complicity in the financial fraud. He was never prosecuted. They had no proof, but suspicion was enough. No team wanted to hire someone involved in the scandal, even marginally. I had been looking for work in the sector for 2 years. He had sent his CV to every car manufacturer in Europe, but no one had even granted him an interview. He had accepted that job to survive, hoping that someone would give him a chance to prove who he really was. Isabel watched him with growing interest. There was something fascinating about that man who had lost everything, yet retained dignity and competence, but she was also irritated by his presumption. Carlos approached the engine with slow and methodical movements, observing each component like a detective. After a few minutes of study, he declared that the problem was not in the design, which was brilliant, but in the assembly. Herrera protested that they had followed every specification. Carlos explained that he wasn't talking about mechanical tolerances, but about synchronization. The engine had 2 hearts that were supposed to beat together like in a symphony, but they were playing 2 different tunes. He indicated a series of almost invisible sensors. The control parameters had been calibrated separately for each system. First the B12, then the electric motor. That was exactly what they had done, following the standard protocol. Carlos explained the mistake. 2 systems that were already calibrated could not be synchronized. They had to be calibrated together simultaneously as a single living organism. The explanation was so simple it seemed brilliant. Isabel felt a spark of hope, but also skepticism. If the solution was so obvious, why hadn't anyone else thought of it? He said sarcastically that talking was easy, but proving it was another thing. Carlos looked at her calmly. He did not seem intimidated by their aggression. He asked for a chance, 12 hours of work, and guaranteed that the engine would sing like a Stradivarius violin. The room erupted in skeptical murmurs. Isabel felt her anger rising. Who was this unknown man to promise results that the best team in Europe had failed to achieve? He exploded, calling him crazy. 12 graduate engineers, 6 months of work, cutting-edge technologies, and he intended to solve it all in one night. Carlos calmly replied that he wasn't trying to do anything. He was just making a suggestion. Isabel stared at him with increasing intensity. There was something provocative about that man that awakened her competitive side. Options were running out. In 3 days he would have to admit failure. It was then that the phrase that would change everything came out, uttered in the heat of the moment. You know what I'm saying? If you actually manage to fix this engine that 12 engineers haven't been able to repair, I'll marry you. The room fell completely silent. Everyone stared at Isabel with incredulous expressions. Carlos didn't smile. He looked her straight in the eyes with absolute seriousness. Do I accept? Carlos's words hung in the air like a challenge to fate. Isabel immediately realized the folly of what she had done, but it was too late to retract her statement in front of a room full of witnesses. The engineers looked at each other with expressions somewhere between amusement and embarrassment. Isabel tried to regain control by establishing the rules. 12 hours, from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. If the engine worked, they would keep the agreement. If it didn't work, Carlos would disappear forever. Carlos accepted the conditions. He requested full access to the laboratory, diagnostic instruments, and technical manuals. Isabel granted them, specifying that he would work alone, without help from the team. The rest of the day unfolded in a surreal atmosphere. News of the bet spread quickly throughout the building. Some employees found the situation amusing, others were worried, and many were secretly betting on the outcome. Isabel tried to concentrate on her ordinary work, but her thoughts kept returning to what she had done. How could she have been so impulsive? If Carlos were to solve the problem, he would find himself in an impossible situation. At 8 p.m., Isabel accompanied Carlos to the laboratory. It was a sterile, high-tech environment, filled with computerized diagnostic instruments. The engine was positioned on a test bench surrounded by sensors. Isabel specified that security cameras would record everything to ensure that he worked alone. Carlos looked around with the air of someone who finally felt at home. His eyes shone as he observed the instruments. Before Isabel left, he asked her why she had agreed. Even if he managed to do it, what would he gain? I couldn't believe that she really was Carlos interrupting her, explaining that he had lost everything 2 years earlier. Work, reputation, future. This was the only opportunity to prove who he really was. If he failed, he would be in the same situation. If he succeeded, it would have proven that Carlos Ruiz was still worth something. Regarding marriage, she said that she would never marry someone like him, and they both knew it, but she would keep her word, and that would do her honor. That night, Isabel couldn't sleep. She lay awake in her attic in Salamanca, imagining what was happening in the laboratory. I was surprised to find myself hoping Carlos would succeed, not so much because of the personal implications as because of the poetic justice of the situation. At 6 a.m., he couldn't resist any longer. He went to the office 2 hours earlier than planned. The cameras confirmed that Carlos had worked all night, completely absorbed in his element, disassembling and reassembling components with surgical precision. At 8 o'clock sharp, Isabel entered the laboratory, followed by the team of engineers who didn't want to miss the moment of truth. The laboratory had the air of having been the scene of an epic battle. Spreadsheets were scattered everywhere. Diagnostic instruments displayed complex graphics, and at the center of it all, the engine looked different. Not physically, but there was something about his presence that suggested a fundamental change. Carlos was standing next to the test bench. His overalls were dirty with grease, his hair was disheveled, but his eyes shone with a light that had nothing to do with tiredness. He looked like a general who had won an impossible battle. Isabel approached, followed by the team of skeptical but curious engineers. Herrera leaned over the control computers, studying the parameters that Carlos had entered during the night. After a few minutes, he murmured in disbelief. Carlos had completely recalibrated the mapping with algorithms that Herrera did not recognize. Carlos explained that he had developed some of them during the fire-throwing era to synchronize the KS with the main engine. Others had been adapted from aeronautical systems. The principle was always the same, 2 power systems that had to behave as one. Isabel stared at the engine without saying anything. From the outside he looked identical, but Carlos had the air of someone who had performed a miracle. Isabel requested the demonstration. Carlos approached the control panel with calm and confident movements. Before turning it on, he briefly explained what he had done. He had created a protocol that made the 2 systems reason as a single organism rather than separate entities. Herrera nodded, studying the data, admitting that theoretically it should work. Carlos pressed the start button. The laboratory was filled with an electronic buzz, followed by the sound of a V12 engine waking up. But instead of the unpleasant vibrations and metallic noise of the previous engine, it began to spin with a sound that was pure mechanical music. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now we continue with the video. The parameters on the monitors showed perfect values, optimal temperature, consumption within limits, and almost zero emissions. The most extraordinary thing was the harmony between the 2 propulsion systems. The transition from the internal combustion engine to the electric motor occurred without uncertainty, as if they had been designed to work together from the beginning. Isabel was speechless. The engineers crowded around the monitors in disbelief. The engine, which had driven them to despair for months, was now working better than theoretical predictions. Herrera whispered that it was impossible, that the parameters were better than those foreseen by the original project. Carlos explained that when 2 systems worked in perfect synchronization, the result exceeded the sum of its parts. Isabel looked at him with a mixture of admiration, disbelief, and something that resembled attraction. This man had saved his company, his reputation, and a $500 million contract. She had done in 12 hours what the best team in Europe had not achieved in 6 months. But there was a huge problem that was now staring her straight in the eye. He offered his congratulations formally, confirming that the engine was working perfectly. Carlos thanked her with professional pride, mixed with something deeper. The silence that followed was laden with unspoken meanings. Everyone knew the terms of the bet and waited to see what Isabel would do. He told the engineers they had work to do, to prepare a presentation for SEAT before noon. The engineers understood and left slowly, not without first exchanging meaningful glances. In a few minutes, Isabel and Carlos were left alone with the engine that had changed everything. The silence in the laboratory was deafening. Isabel and Carlos looked at each other from opposite sides of the test bench, the engine between them as a witness to the impossible that had just happened. Isabel was the first to speak, acknowledging that Carlos had indeed kept his promise. He had made a promise in front of 12 witnesses. Carlos was not taking advantage of the situation. He remained waiting for her to decide how to handle the most surreal situation of his life. Isabel began walking around the laboratory. He had always solved problems with logic and determination, but this time he was in uncharted territory. He tried to frame the situation as a provocation, a joke uttered in the heat of the moment. Carlos said he understood perfectly, explaining that she had every right to ignore what he had said. She was the CEO of a major Spanish company. He was a former mechanic who cleaned offices, but there was something in Carlos's tone that struck Isabel. It wasn't resentment, but a sad resignation. Isabel asked what he really wanted. Carlos looked at her intensely. He wasn't so naive as to think they could actually get married. She lived in a golden world 50 stories above reality. He, in a studio in Vallecas, taking 2 buses to get to work, explained what he really wanted: public recognition for having solved the problem. Hiring her on the research team with the role her skills deserved and maintaining the fiction of commitment, the time needed to rebuild her reputation. The proposal was rational and pragmatic, a business agreement disguised as a love story. She would save face by keeping her word. He would get the opportunity to return to work in the industry he loved. After a few months, they would discover that they were incompatible. Isabel studied Carlos's face, looking for cynicism, but seeing desperation masked as pragmatism. If he said no, he would go back to cleaning offices. But he would have had the satisfaction of proving that he was still worth something. Isabel approached the window that overlooked Madrid. The city lay below her, filled with stories of success and failure, second chances and broken dreams. For the first time, he found himself in a situation that he could not control with money or authority. He said he was crazy, completely crazy. The media would devour them alive, the millionaire CEO and the former mechanic in the gossip papers for months. Carlos replied that he didn't think gossip scared her. Isabel admitted that it didn't scare her. It irritated her, but she had learned to deal with it. After long minutes of reflection, weighing options that just a few hours earlier he would never have imagined having to consider, he made the decision. Okay, let's do it. Carlos raised his eyebrows in surprise at the speed. Isabel set her conditions. First, he became responsible for the development of hybrid engines with a 3-year contract. Second, their relationship would last exactly 6 months. Third, no one should ever know that it was fake. And fourth, if he ever betrayed their agreement or tried to harm her, she would destroy him completely. Carlos agreed. They shook hands like 2 businessmen, but when they touched, they both felt an electric shock that had nothing to do with business. The first few days of the fake engagement were a comedy of errors. Isabel had underestimated how difficult it was to fake a romantic relationship with someone she barely knew. The media pounced on the story like vultures. The cleaning lady and the mechanic, a fairy tale love, headlined El País. The tabloids invented romantic stories about how they had met. Isabel had to quickly learn the details of Carlos's life in order to answer the journalists. He discovered that he had been born in Valencia, the son of a mechanic and a teacher. He had studied mechanical engineering at the Polytechnic University of Madrid, graduating with top marks before being discovered by Formula One. Carlos had to adapt to Isabel's golden world. Dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, social events, award ceremonies where the presence of the couple of the moment was highly sought after. At first he felt like an actor in a role that was too big, but gradually he began to relax. The decisive moment came 3 weeks after the start of the farce. It was late, and Isabel had arranged to meet at the office to review the final contracts with Seat. The official engine test had been an extraordinary success, exceeding all expectations. Carlos knocked on the door around 10 p.m. He had seen the light on and wanted to make sure everything was okay. Isabel looked up, noticing how Carlos had changed in recent weeks. Her clothes were more carefully chosen. Her hair was professionally cut. Her posture more confident. But above all, in her eyes she had recovered that spark of passion. Isabel explained that she was reviewing the agreement with Seat. Thanks to him, they had obtained even better conditions. Carlos sat down asking to ask a personal question. I wanted to know why she had actually agreed to his deal. He could have ignored the bet without consequences. Isabel put down her pen, lost in thought. At first he had done it out of pride, so as not to appear as someone who does not keep his word, but now he thought it had been one of the best decisions of his life. Carlos had saved her. He had solved a problem that was about to cost him everything, but above all he had made him understand that true talent had nothing to do with titles or pedigree. He got up and went to the window. In recent weeks I had discovered that Carlos was the most brilliant engineer I had ever met. Their solutions were innovative, elegant, and effective. The team adored him because he solved problems considered impossible. But there was something more. She liked the person she was when she was with him. Less arrogant, less sure of always being right. He challenged her in ways no one had dared. Carlos approached the window. I knew it was all fake, just a business deal. But in recent weeks she had begun to forget where fiction ended and something else began. Carlos admitted that he too had begun to forget. Their first kiss was sweet and uncertain, as if they were crossing an unknown line. When they separated, they looked at each other with new eyes. Isabel whispered that it complicated everything. Carlos admitted that yes, but perhaps the best complications were the ones that weren't planned. The following months were a gradual, reciprocal discovery. Isabel learned to appreciate the simplicity that Carlos brought to her life. Dinners in neighborhood taverns, walks in the Retiro Park, real conversations instead of diplomatic chatter. Carlos discovered that behind the facade of being self-righteous or ruthless, Isabel was an intelligent and passionate woman who had hidden her vulnerability behind the armor of success. The R&D team became the most innovative in the company under Carlos' leadership. Their unconventional methods led to technological advances that positioned Automotive Mendoza at the forefront of the sector. But the biggest change was in Isabel. Investors noticed that she had become more collaborative, less interested in dominating, and more focused on results. The press began to talk about a new leadership. The decisive moment came after exactly 6 months when their agreement expired. They were in the laboratory where it had all begun, looking at the engine now in production for Seat. Isabel noted that technically her agreement expired that day. They had to announce the breakup, tell the media that they had discovered they were incompatible. They looked at each other in silence for long minutes. Then Carlos smiled, saying there was a problem. He had truly fallen in love with her. Isabel felt her heart leap. It was a serious problem, a very serious one, because she had also truly fallen in love with him. The second kiss was completely different from the first. There was no longer any uncertainty, but the certainty of two people who had found something real in the most unexpected place. A year later, the royal wedding of Elizabeth and Charles was the social event of the year. Not only because of the romantic contrast, but because it represented something profound, proof that love could be born in the most unexpected ways. During the reception, Isabel gave a speech that became legendary. A year ago I made the craziest bet of my life. I thought I was only risking my reputation. I didn't know I was gambling with my future and my happiness. Carlos didn't just fix a broken engine, he fixed me. Carlos replied, a year ago he was a man who had lost everything. Isabel gave me not only a second professional chance, but a first chance to truly love. He taught me that the most impossible challenges hide the most precious rewards. Under their joint leadership, Automotive Mendoza became one of the world leaders in automotive innovation, but more importantly, it became an example of how true love and mutual respect could transform not just two people, but an entire organization. 5 years later, When her first son Marco was born, the prototype repaired by Carlos with a plate was still in Isabel's office. Sometimes the most impossible challenges lead to the most beautiful results. The story became legendary in the industrial world not because of its romantic aspect, but because it demonstrated that true talent can emerge from any condition, that love can be born from the most improbable situations, and that sometimes a bet made out of pride can transform into the most beautiful destiny imaginable. Every year on the anniversary of the challenge, Carlos would fire up that engine to remind everyone that miracles happen when talent finds opportunity, and true love when pride gives way to vulnerability. 10 years later, Automotive Mendoza Ruiz, the name had changed after the marriage, had revolutionized the Spanish automotive industry. But the real revolution had been personal. Two people who had learned that life's greatest challenges often transform into the most precious gifts, and that the most authentic love is born when you have the courage to take a chance on someone the world has underestimated. The company had expanded operations to Latin America, establishing plants in Mexico, Colombia, and Argentina. Carlos led technological innovation while Isabel handled global strategy, creating a business synergy that was as effective as their marriage. His story inspired a new generation of Spanish entrepreneurs who understood that true leadership did not come from titles, but from talent, and that the best business partnerships were often born from mutual respect and genuine admiration. The engine that had changed their lives was now on display at the Museum of Technological Innovation in Madrid, not only as a brilliant piece of engineering, but as a symbol that love and professional success could grow together when based on authentic values. Carlos and Isabel continued to defy social conventions, proving that class differences meant nothing when two people were committed to building something beautiful together. Her story became living proof that USA had evolved into a society where merit triumphed over privilege and where true love could blossom in the most unexpected places. Like this post, if you believe true talent can emerge from any condition. Share a story about a time you underestimated someone based on appearances. Share to honor those who never give up despite setbacks. Subscribe for more life-changing revenge stories. Sometimes the person who can save you is the one you ignore. Sometimes the craziest bets lead to the most beautiful results. And sometimes love is born when pride gives way to respect.